Thank you for listening to Beyond the Big Screen podcast, where we talk about great movies and stories so great they should be movies. Links to learn more about our guest today can be found in the show notes. You can support Beyond the Big Screen on Patreon.com. By joining on Patreon, you help keep Beyond the Big Screen sustainable and get many great benefits. Go to patreon.com/Beyond the Big Screen to learn more and sign up. Find show notes, links to subscribe, and leave Apple Podcast reviews by going to our website, beyondthebigscreen.com. And now, let's go beyond the big screen.
Discovered. And so Babylon is a term they used for degenerate Rome. And so many scholars believe that those letters were written by Peter while he was in Rome. Luther denied this, and it was a subject of some controversy. They're clearly written by somebody who knows that there's a terrible persecution occurring and who is not in fear, but in acceptance of his own death coming.
What were the circumstances surrounding Peter's death in Rome? Because that'll be an important part later on as we go on in this story.
Well, the Roman Empire, as all governments of man tend to do, had degenerated, and it had had some great emperors, but finally it ended up with the Emperor Nero. Nero was about as low an animal as it was possible to have as an emperor, and he was a massive egotist with an elevated view of his own self. He thought he was a great musician. He appeared in the Olympics, compelling everybody to give up when he showed up, and he conceived of building a huge palace in the middle of Rome, occupying the Forum, occupying Palatine Hill, and much of the center of Rome. And he needed at least 110 acres to do that. He was going to build a huge statue of himself, 110 feet high, standing on top of the world. And so about where the Colosseum is, and from there on in the summer of 66 AD, he started a fire, and the fire burned the temple of Jupiter. I mean, it burned, which was 700 years old. It burned all the great houses on the Palatine Hill. It burned suburbia, which was where the poor people lived. And so it just sort of burned out the heart of everybody. And as you can imagine, the Romans were very, very angry. And so to save himself, Nero had to start a rumor. And Nero claimed that a secret, almost unknown cult of a few thousand people following a convicted criminal named Christ were actually responsible for the fire. Of course, that was a lie, but that didn't affect him. And so he directed the fury of the mob onto the Christians and began the first really great systematic persecution of Christians. Many of the Christians were executed in Nero's gardens. They were lit as torches. Some were crucified upside down. Little children, according to the Roman historian Tacitus, writing about 50 years or 60 years later, some were little kids were actually sewn into animal skins and thrown to dogs and torn to pieces. Even Tacitus was amazed by the horror of what had happened. And that persecution consumed not only Peter, but also Paul, the two greatest leaders at the time of the Christian church.
I always like to hear the story behind the story. How much of the story of St. Peter, his death and burial, did you know before you started researching and writing this book?
I knew the general outline of the story, Stephen. The way I really learned about this is began to learn about it. In the summer of 2008, I was a sort of a speaker on a cruise, and I went to Rome. I'd been there before with terrible guides where I'd ask the guide questions. Say, here, you can buy some jewelry over here. It's terrible. And I did meet a wonderful priest in the catacombs who was great. But in any event, in the summer of 2008, we once again had a pretty mediocre guide, and a man named Michael Novak, who is a great Christian writer and Catholic theologian and writer, sort of pushed everybody out of the way, and he took over the tour. He was a close friend of John Paul II. He actually took us down through to see the tomb of Peter. He knew some, but not all of the story. And that made a tremendous impact on me. When I got home to Houston, I was sitting at a table at lunch, and I began telling the story to my friend, George Strait Jr. And he said, John, I know the whole story. We financed the whole thing when I was a little kid. And so that was how the book came about. Indeed, I thought the more I learned about it, the more I knew that that was a story that any Christian and really anybody interested in archaeology needed to know.
So one of your major sources of this book was really the source himself, the Strake family. What were some of your other sources that you used for this book?
Well, there was a wonderful earlier book written around with the assistance of Carducci, written around 1980 or 1981, called The Bones of St. Peter. And it was a wonderful source. Carducci wrote a whole series of articles, and they were great. And Carducci herself wrote 3 or 4 different books. They're fabulous books. They're just very hard to read in translation because they're very technical, and they're great sources on the writing, Stephen. Someday someone's going to take those books and do a better job than us on the inscriptions that were found below the Vatican. There were a lot of articles, some in Italian, some in Spanish. For example, there was a Spanish journalist who actually showed up. He wanted to do an article on alien beings, and for some reason he was researching the Vatican Library. And all of a sudden, a minion of Farua comes in and hands him this stuff and says, "See, Carducci is not telling the truth." And so it gave you some sense of the furious contest between Farua on one side and Carducci on the other side. So there were a whole sequence in a lot of different languages of stuff we found.
Now, Peter, it was presumed based on the apocryphal documents that he was buried somewhere beneath St. Peter's Basilica for going on 2,000 odd years. Why did it become such an issue for Pius XII in the 1930s and the 1940s to finally dig underneath St. Peter's to prove this?
Well, Luther had claimed, of course, that the entire church at Rome was a fraud, that Peter had never made it to Rome, and that the church was actually built on the pagan foundations of the Roman Empire. The church had actually gone down and tried to excavate looking for Peter at the time the original St. Peter's was removed and a new St. Peter's was built. They dropped 2 tunnels, and lo and behold, what did they find but pagan statues and so on? A terrible statue of a guy holding up a goblet who's sort of half naked and saying, "Bring me the young women, for you too shall die." Well, this was not what the priests were looking for in 1500 or thereabouts. And so they threw the statue away and sealed it up. But you see, Pius had great faith. And unlike those people that sealed it in 1500, he knew that Peter was there. Pius had grown up in the Vatican. His father had been a Vatican lawyer. And from earliest days, the Vatican was almost his home. And so he always knew and felt that he dreamed of Rome as it was in the days of Peter. And he always felt great affinity. And so he was certain Peter was there. And he was willing to take the terrible chance of proving really that it was just all not true, or that Peter maybe had died in Antioch and so on. He was willing to take that chance because he believed Peter was there. And that's exactly why he did it.
Can you speak a bit to Pius XII? He's a controversial figure, and some say that he worked really hard to save the Jews of Rome and Italy during the Holocaust, but there's others who say that he was complicit and worked with the Nazis. How do we get the 2 very different pictures of Pius XII?
The complicit stuff started really with the KGB disinformation campaign in the 1950s. I went back and I actually read the newspaper articles after the liberation of Rome in July 1944. And the spiritual head, the rabbi who was the spiritual head of Rome, actually is quoted. And he said, "Pius is our father. Pius saved thousands of us. History will always remember what Pius has helped to do to save our community." So there's no question Pius played a tremendous role in saving the Jews in Italy. There were 1 million Jews in Italy before the Nazis took control, essentially in the summer of 1943, about summer of 1943. Most of them, over 700,000, survived, and that was principally because of the Catholic Church. As the book outlines, some survived in places that George Strait here in Houston actually purchased. In the course of writing the book, we got a picture of approximately 12 priests, and some of them have beards, and they're all long caskets and so on. And it was with a letter. And the woman said, those are not priests. Those are Jewish doctors. That's my grandfather. They were all hidden in what was called the North American College during World War II. And this was their final picture after the Americans liberated Rome. So what he had done is much earlier, the Catholic Church, probably unwisely, had entered into a treaty in Germany in 1933, in which Hitler agreed to leave them alone if they would stay out of politics. That was probably a mistake, but they had no idea of the type of monster they were dealing with. I think that they believed, as many capitalists in the United States and elsewhere believed falsely, that Hitler was just a guy who'd run the trains on time. Of course, he was a monster. Like Stalin, he was a complete monster. They only came to realize that later. Of course, Hitler hated Pius XII in particular. He gave orders to kidnap him and bring him back to Rome after blowing up Rome in July of 1944. The only reason that didn't happen is the commandant of Rome was a Catholic, and he refused to follow the orders. That's the truth of what actually happened.
Yeah, because these concordats that the papacy signed, they had been doing things like that for 100 years beforehand with civil and secular governments.
Well, they did the same thing with Mussolini. In exchange for Mussolini's promise not to destroy them, they would stay out of politics. And although Mussolini was a tyrant, he was not the sort of monster that we ran into with that the world ran into with Hitler and Stalin. He was a guy who beat up his opponents, he imprisoned them, and that was about the extent of his tyranny. It was a whole different world with Hitler.
Now, for those who've never been to Rome or who had one of those lousy tour guides that you've spoken of, what is the Vatican Hill neighborhood and how does it fit in with the topography and the history of Rome?
Well, Vatican is actually built on what was a long time ago a hill, and it was a hill right outside of the traditional wall of Rome, about roughly 300 yards from what became Nero's palace. And it was a garbage dump. That's what it was. It was a hill, okay, but not one of the 7 hills of Rome. It's not so far off the Tiber River, and it was used to throw stuff on. And what really happened is, of course, Peter, after he was killed, was just the body of a slave. His body was thrown on that hill, and his friends came and Christians came. They buried him. They eventually put up a marker. And then
Steve here. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, featuring great shows like Scott Rank's History Unplugged podcast and other great podcasts. Go to parthenonpodcast.com to learn more. And here is a quick word from our sponsors.
And he had promised specifically his mother, Helena, that upon, and he had promised perhaps God himself, that if he succeeded in winning at the Battle of Miletius Bridge, and if he actually succeeded in becoming emperor, that he would actually build a large church over the grave of the Apostle Peter. And so he had a problem, though, because it's filled up with all these Roman tombs. If he knocks down the tombs, he's going to have a revolution on his hands. His solution was to take the whole hill and fill it with 2 million tons of fill, so that it's now level and you can now build on it, and then build a huge wooden church, the original St. Peter's Basilica, right over, centered directly over what was Peter's grave. And for 1,000 years, that was the greatest church in all of Christendom, the greatest church in the world. There were 300 popes buried there. Charlemagne was crowned there for the very first time. A lot of the great early art of the Renaissance was there. It started to fall down by 1450. And so the popes then, probably not thoughtfully enough, decided to take it down and then to replace it with a stone church. And that is the church we see today. But they built it exactly over the same footing, so that the top of the dome remained over exactly the same place that it had remained back in 330 when Constantine finished the first St. Peter's.
It's interesting you bring up Constantine because this archaeological dig proved a lot of facts. And one thing with Constantine, his whole conversion of the in hoc vincit, or in this sign I'll conquer, a lot of modern scholars thought that that was sort of a padding that was added to his record. But in your research and in the digs into the archaeological situation underneath the floor of St. Peter's, is they found this inscription in the graffiti not very long after the time of Constantine. Can you maybe speak to some of that and some of those surprises that were found under there?
Well, it's real important to understand what was so amazing about the area under the foundation of St. Peter is that absolutely nobody had ever been there after 330 AD. So think of it, time capsule. That's what it was. Nobody had ever gone in there after 330 AD until Carducci went down. And what happened, of course, as the book describes, is they were trying to bury Pope Pius XI. A workman fell down into one of these huge tombs, which had all been covered. And so everything moved from there. Well, one of the very first discoveries that Carducci made was the great symbol, of course, in the sign, "Thou shalt conquer." Christian tradition had always said that at the Battle of Meletius Bridge, where a historical battle, where Constantine was outnumbered 3-1 by Maximus and had no effective chance, that his soldiers he saw in the sky the words, "In this sign you shall conquer," with a cross, and they had his soldiers all put a cross on. And of course, they won the bridge, and they won the battle, and he became the emperor of Rome. Well, this was dismissed as sort of babble, the sort of story that people make up. I mean, come on now, this is Ghost Riders in the sky, so it couldn't have happened, right? At least that's what the typical cynics who are cynics about everything said. Well, Carducci goes down, and she's down there. Nobody's been there for hundreds of years, for thousands of years. And what does she find? Exactly that, exactly those words carved sometime before 330 AD. The Battle of Meletius Bridge was roughly 309 AD. And so it's within 20 years of the battle by people who would have actually seen the sign. So it wasn't a story that got made up later on. It was at worst a story that everybody believed at the time.
And that's fascinating. And a little bit more about the archaeological dig. It can almost be described as a wildcat dig. Was the archaeology done in accordance with the science of the day? Because archaeology has changed a lot since the 1940s. Or were they cutting corners so that they could get to the juicier finds, you might call them?
Well, for a while, that's exactly what they were doing. The Pope Pius, this all began in 1939 with the workman who fell into the tomb, and that led to discovery of the underground. Pope Pius XII was terribly concerned that word would leak out. He was also concerned that Mussolini would seize control of the whole dig. Mussolini didn't care about Christ, he didn't care about Peter, but he did care about the Roman Empire, and those were Roman tombs, one of the greatest collections of Roman tombs in the world. And so Pius gave orders that had to be kept strictly secret, that the only things that would be used were hand tools, almost impossible, under this huge church with millions of tons of fill, and that only priests and workers at the Vatican would be used. And so they started on the excavation. And that's what they did for 10 years. It's pretty easy to criticize a lot of what they did during that period of time. In 1952, I think at the suggestion, I suspect at the suggestion without proof of George Strake, the Strakes all went in 51, 52 to visit Pius XII. And they met with Father Ferrua, Father Koss, all the people involved in the dig. Now, I believe and cannot prove that they had a conversation with Strake, who had financed the whole thing. And they said, we're uncomfortable with this dig because we wonder if we've gotten the right people. We've tried to do it all in-house. And I believe that Strake said, well, go get the best man in the world. Go hire the best man you can possibly get, and I'll pay for him, because Strake had done it over and over again. And I think they said, well, there's a problem, George. He said, well, what do you mean? And this is my supposition. He said, they said, well, George, the best man in the world isn't a man at all. The best man in the world is a woman. And not only is she a woman, but she is an agnostic as far as we can tell. So they hired her anyway. And they brought in Margherita Guarducci. Guarducci looked at the work. She, of course, realized instantly it was one of the greatest archaeological sites in all of human history. And she met directly with Pius XII. And we know, I'm sure that Pius XII wanted her to say, boy, what a wonderful job. We know she said they've done a terrible job. They haven't photographed, they've discarded these inscriptions as meaningless, although the inscriptions are incredibly important to human history. They haven't done forensic analysis of the bones that are available, which have to be done. And many steps need to be taken to preserve the wonderful mosaics and so on, some of the earliest painting in the world, surviving painting. And astoundingly, here's this woman coming in who's an agnostic in 1952, and in an age, obviously, of male dominance everywhere, but particularly in Italy. And what they did was essentially fire the priest involved and put her in charge of the whole thing. And that's exactly where she remained for the next 23 years. And she was really the person who unlocked the secrets of what is now the Scavi. She was a remarkable archaeologist, Stephen. She was, to me, sort of an idiot savant, if I can excuse the bad language. But what I mean is she had no political skill. She was the kind of person that would go to the Pope and say, you did a terrible job. And at the same time, she had the genius to actually take those inscriptions and figure out what they meant, and the patience to spend years and years and years understanding them, as she did in prior work in Greece, where she did stuff foundational to all of Greek archaeology. And that's how Guarducci got started.
I want to talk a bit more about Guarducci, but for a second, maybe we can talk about George Strake. George Strake was a Catholic, but he was, I guess how we made his real name was that he was fabulously wealthy from finding oil in Texas. And my question was, okay, so I understand that this was that Pius wanted to keep this a secret, but there's a lot of high roller Catholics around the world. Why did Pius want George Strake in particular, George Strait, another great Texan, but not related to this. Why did Pius go and actually contact George Strake for this, as opposed to anybody else to fund this?
I think there were two big reasons. The first big reason, this is the Great Depression. The American stock markets crashed. The Catholic Church in particular is in ruins. Mexico has been destroyed. Spain is on fire. The Nazis are controlling Germany. The church in Russia and Eastern Europe is essentially cut to pieces, at least as an institution. Mussolini is in Italy. And so there weren't many people to match the immense wealth of Strake. Strake was a billionaire at a point in time when there weren't any millionaires. So Strake was literally one of the wealthiest men in the entire world. And that was the first big reason. He had unlimited financial capability. The second reason is he was very unusual. He gave money over and over again to the Catholic Church in the 30s, and he had only one condition. And you know what the condition was, Stephen? The condition was that absolutely no one will ever know that I've given you this money. You have to promise me absolute secrecy in my gift. That's because two reasons. I think he believed very strongly in the biblical admonition that you can take credit here or in the next world, and preferred getting his credit in the next world. And one says he told his son, he believed that if people had any idea how much money he was giving away, you'd be mobbed by hundreds of people asking for money, particularly in the Great Depression. So he was the kind of guy that you could actually go to, as Father Carroll did. Remember, Strake is a guy that drills at great risk underground, discovers the third largest oil field on earth in a place everybody says it's impossible. So he's a risk taker. He was the ideal donor because you could go to him, as Carroll did, and say, look, Pope Pius has this question. We have a project. It's the most important project of the Catholic Church. It's probably going to fail. It has to be held completely secret. No one will ever know you participated. And if you do, you'll get no credit. Nobody will ever know you even had anything to do with it. Strake was consumed by the Bible. He read the Bible every single night. And so the idea of actually covering and finding the actual place where Peter's bones and tomb were, the place that the Prince of Apostles, Christ's number one man, was irresistibly attractive. And I think Strake would have given not only his fortune, but his life to do that.
Did anybody find out during Strake's life that he was the financier of this operation?
No, never. Nobody ever found out until this book. It was held in confidence by him throughout his life until his death in 1970, and then by his children in very much the same way. And until that, actually, the lunch I had with his, there were pictures published of the Strakes meeting with the Pope and with all the excavators, but there was never any explanation of the fact he had been the guy behind the whole thing and of his direct involvement in it. We met, Stephen, when we were doing this book. I can't tell you, I went to Washington and I spoke in a building owned by the Archdiocese of Washington. And they said, John, you know that George Strake gave us this building, don't you? I had no idea. When I was in New York, I spoke with a priest on a radio show. And he said, yes, we still have oil wells that George Strake gave us. So you have to understand, he was giving everything away, and much of it secret from nobody knew about it, much of it secret even from his own children. The reason they knew all about this is that by the time they were 15, 16, 17, he took them to Rome. They met directly with all the excavators. But before that, George had been a guy that just disappeared, went to Rome for days, sometimes weeks at a time. And they didn't realize what he was doing. But when they showed up in Rome and Pius said, oh, this is my great friend, George Strake, who's been so wonderful to us. And then later, Pope Paul said exactly the same things. And the letters that they have, some of which we put, I think, in the book, that's when they realized what had actually happened.
I mean, he is so different, George Strake, than almost any other billionaire philanthropist you could ever think of. He didn't put his name on every single thing. And even in the commercial aspect, George Strake being one of the richest people of all time, I've never heard of him.
He never wanted to be. He would be thrilled that he's not in Wikipedia. His son has an entry in Wikipedia because his son is a wonderful man and has done a lot of serious things here in Texas. And so he's in Wikipedia and everywhere, but not George. George is only in some of the oil industry stuff, where, of course, he's a legend because of his discovery of the Great Conroe Field. He did everything he could to remain anonymous. That was exactly, I have to tell you myself, when I went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which is a series of halls with huge names of the hedge fund billionaires, one after another, or other places, all sort of glorifying them. I was amazed comparing it to George Strake, a guy who was in his day much wealthier than all of them, and who absolutely wanted not a single word about his gift to be known to anybody, and did everything he could to ensure there wasn't.
Yeah, it's really amazing. Now, to get back to Margherita Guarducci, as you stated, she was probably the top archaeologist of her day. What were some of the discoveries that she made and the light that she shed onto this archaeological site that had not been particularly well run? What did she discover?
Well, before she ever got to the Vatican, she did the decryption of a thing that was called the Gorton Code, or the Great Code. It was a series of huge rock slabs, and people had looked at them and it meant nothing to them. And so that was sort of, people ignored them from 1880 until 1920 or thereabouts, when she came along. And over 20 some years, she sat and slowly decrypted those. They were the actual laws of a Greek city-state in the Golden Age. So they showed you, if you assaulted someone, what happened to you? If you stole property, what happened to you? If you died, where did your property go? And the changes made from time to time. One thing they showed is that women in the early days were treated with a great deal more respect than later, in the later history of the Golden Age, among many other things, although that wasn't the point of everything she did. She did that. It took her 24 years to do that. She was like sits with the crossword puzzle that nobody else can figure out. She got under there, and the very first thing she found was the thing we discussed, the allusion to the Battle of Meletius Bridge. And then she moved on, and she found a lot of other early Christian inscriptions. She fixated on a wall called the graffiti wall. And it had many different inscriptions on it. It had been dismissed by the priest. It's just indecipherable. And it was very close, within a couple of feet of the dead Plumb Bob Center. If you dropped a line from the top of the dome down, the place where they had expected to find Peter, the first thing she found were many Peter inscriptions. Peter was represented by a symbol with two keys through it. Remember that the people that are carving this are, they're 300 yards from Nero's temple. They're going to carve them if they can find out what they're doing. And so she found 21 different inscriptions relating to Peter on that. And from that, she deduced that one of them was Peter is here. Another one was Peter is near, and so on. From that, she deduced that Peter must be right there. She found a hole in the wall. She learned that there had been bones in the hole in the wall. She secured the bones, took them to a forensic anthropologist. He found that they were the bones of approximately a 65-year-old man, roughly 5'10", who had been crucified upside down. His feet had been cut off, and there were nail marks, and that he had been covered in purple cloth, which was very unusual, and buried right there, but then taken and put into the wall when it was constructed, sometime between 250 and 330 AD. And the anthropologist declared that that was Peter. The most important thing she found, Stephen, was not actually Peter's bone. It was the theology uncovered by the inscriptions that she found. In the 1960s, 70s in particular, there was a massive attack, a lot of it led by former Catholic priests on the Catholic Church, saying this is a Jewish cult. There are other books like the Book of Mary Magdalene, the Book of Thomas, that were just arbitrarily thrown out. And these were just Jewish cultists. But what she found from 66, roughly AD, around Peter's grave were inscriptions that had a Chi-Rho symbol, that was Christ, a line with a Roman cross like a T, with another line with a V symbol for victory, or an R symbol for the Roman word redempto. And so she found, and it's discussed in greater length in the book, she found the basic theology of Christianity put there, that people believed Christ was divine, that he was reborn. She found over and over again the Christ symbol, Omega Alpha. This is the end, was the end of Christ, but it was only the beginning. Likewise for Peter and for Mary. And so what she uncovered, she took that. And of course, the question is, did it occur just there or somewhere else? What was very inspiring is she found the same code and same symbols in the prisoner section of the Colosseum and in Ephesus, where there had been a large Christian presence dating back to Paul. And so she was able to prove that those symbols weren't one of a kind, that was actually almost a code language that early Christians were speaking in because of the fear of persecution. And that was the whole game, Stephen. That was what told us that from the very beginning, from the time almost that Christ died and that Peter was killed, Christians believed that, right or wrong, they believed he was divine and that he died to redeem all of us.
That really fascinated me, in that Margherita Guarducci is brought in, and she's, like you said, agnostic, maybe even atheist, but and certainly skeptical of the entire theological foundation and trying to find theology. But then when she starts digging, she's finding things that are backing up all of the ancient writings. And I think that was, to me, what was so interesting, especially in contrast to the actual priest who was in charge, Antonio Ferrua, who is seeing the same evidence, and he's coming to very different conclusions.
Well, it's interesting. In 1992, she was very old, and she was actually led up onto a stage because, like me, she was nearly blind. And they had a debate. She debated the people who essentially took the Ferrua approach plus her. And she said something I thought was very profound. She said she never attacked these guys. She wrote article over article about how she was right, but never how they were wrong. And she finally said, the one thing that hurt me in all of this is that they claimed that I allowed my faith to overwhelm my science, but I had no faith except for my science. My faith started with my science. That's how I got faith. And of course, the moderator, whose name is in the book, who was the head of Sotheby Europe, said, "Sorry, Father, and I appreciate this great debate, but I have to tell you, even though I'm an agnostic, there's no question she's found Peter," which I thought was remarkable. And the audience cheered. And of course, that was the beginning of the end for the cynics, and the end of the beginning for her great find, later acknowledged by Pope Francis in 2013.
What was Antonio Ferrua, Father Ferrua's main argument against that the relics that were found and this archaeological material that was found actually was Peter?
Well, I think there were two or three. First, he challenged, kind of without reason, Carenti's forensic finding, but without reason, he of course went to the fact that the Bible never put.
Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors.
I'm infatuated with with what he had found, and he resented deeply what she did. He had identified other bones as the bones of Peter. Well, when she came, she sent those to a forensic anthropologist. And the forensic anthropologist said, "No, these are the bones of a woman, not a man. These are not Peter's bones." That was a terrible blow to Ferrua. And as a matter of fact, to the church, it was bad. And to be fair, Pius always took the position that you didn't know until you had a forensic examination. So Pius was never saying these are Peter's bones. And the forensic examination revealed beyond question they weren't. Of course, look, put yourself in the same picture. You take 12 years of your life, you put it in a horrible place. You think you found this great archaeological discovery, and in fact, you found the tomb. And all of a sudden, some woman poacher comes in and takes over this great find, and you're fired. You're humiliated, fired. She's given control of this in Italy in 1952, and you would have some idea of how angry Father Ferrua really was, as shown by we have examples. To me, the classic is the Spanish science fiction novelist who shows up at the Vatican to write a book on aliens, and they hand him all sorts of stuff on how bad Ferrua is. But I've read, he wrote a letter actually to Pius, and then wrote a very strong letter to Pope Paul, who also recognized the validity of the bones. And then he wrote a letter very critical of Pope Paul, saying that he was engaging in superstition. And so it was a really surprising letter that a priest would write about, his boss. They didn't do anything to him for it. They, I think, if anything, encouraged the debate. As soon as Paul died, he, by that time, was in charge of archaeology. He was the eparchnic sort of in charge of it. And he went to her and he said, "You're fired. Your services are no longer required. You'll no longer be allowed to come down into the area that now is the Scavitura." Of course, she was 76, and so he thought she'd fold up. And as the book relates, she didn't fold up at all. She continued along, made some of her very greatest discoveries: the discovery of the ancient statue of St. Peter, the discovery of the origin of the Black Madonna, one of the great mysteries of Christendom, and so on, all after age 76. And she fought over and over again for the truth of what she had found in the Vatican, not because she was seeking credit, I don't think. She had all the credit in the world by then, and she was a pretty committed Christian. She just thought it was really important for Christians to know that people in 66 AD, they actually believed Christ redeemed us all with his death. And so in the end, thus far, she's prevailed.
Now, and Pope Francis has recently stated that the official position is that these bones that were discovered are St. Peter's bones. Are they still performing scientific investigations and archaeological investigations into this site and into these bones to learn more from them?
Well, they're certainly still performing archaeological investigation. They began excavating a parking lot on the Vatican Hill, discovered more of these family tombs, which we haven't discussed too much, but these family tombs are in themselves, even if they had nothing to do with St. Peter, they were remarkable Roman archaeology. You can imagine, sort of like homes preserved underground, sort of like Pompeii, except right in the capital city. These are not, deals in, somewhere else. In terms of forensic examination of the bones, I've heard that they may be, but I don't have any details on that. There are none that have been released. But I think they're very satisfied now that they have located both the physical remains of Peter and earlier the physical remains of Paul. Paul, of course, was beheaded outside the walls of Rome on the road down to the port and south of Naples. And a church was instantly built. His remains were located in that church, and they have been also forensically examined. They date both DNA and date back to the right period. The problem with trying to just carbon date the bones is you've got bones that were there from 330 AD, and we know that because the whole deal was sealed in 330 AD, and carbon dating won't take us any closer presently. It'll tell us, oh yeah, these are bones from the early part of the second millennium, but we already know that. And so I think it would be interesting to do DNA analysis if there's sufficient DNA in the bones. But DNA analysis with ancient bones is a hit and miss deal. You have to be lucky enough to get enough preserved DNA to do that. Today, that may not always be the case.
Yeah, I think that probably gets to the key, is that it's always going to be a circumstantial case, if you will. It's always going to be a preponderance of evidence when you're looking into ancient history. There's never going to be a silver bullet to say that, yes, this is 100% Peter, and this is what Peter was all about. You just can't say that after nearly 2,000 years.
I have to tell you, Stephen, I tried maybe 200 cases. If I tried that case, I would win that case every single time on whether she found his bones. I would never lose, not once, I don't think. The amazing thing about it, if you think about it, he died 2,000 years ago, Peter, roughly, and you have this big hill that's 110 acres or so on top. It's covered over his bones 2,000 years ago, and so it's the classic needle in a haystack. It is just absolutely dumbfounding that she was able to find him and find that tomb. Of course, the tell was always the fact that it was straight down from the top of the dome, and they left the dome in the same position in 1500 when they rebuilt the deal. That's what made it possible to locate him. But to have the genius to actually understand all the graffiti on the wall where everybody else had given up, and then actually locate the bones that had been in that little spot and taken out and put in a box, that was raw genius. I don't think anybody could have done that except Carducci in the 20th century.
What I would love to hear is your thoughts on, we hear so many things. There was recently the Gospel of Jesus's Wife, which was a business card fragment that the first time scientists and experts looked at it, they knew it was a fraud, but it perpetuated for years after that this is going to blow up Christianity. And this is something that's been more or less known for 20 plus years, this case of Peter's bones, yet we hear almost nothing about it. There should be documentaries, and because it is such a tight case archaeologically and scientifically, that proves texts and it proves what people were thinking back then. And it's beyond just a faith argument. It's physical evidence. Why do we know so little about this story?
Well, it isn't to some degree intentionally suppressed. you and I live in a world that's materialistic. People don't want to actually imagine that there's a spiritual world. They don't want to reckon with the possibility of it. And so that's all a conspiracy theory, and that's done by nuts like me or something. And they discount and are unwilling to actually look at physical evidence because it would disrupt kind of the worldview that they have created. They're willing to, believe the madness of Stalin, promising heaven but delivering hell over and over again, but unwilling to believe the physical evidence of the chain of custody, really, of Peter and of the Bible. The story I always think about is, there are 4 basic books of the Bible: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And the thing that everyone said when I was growing up, even some Christian theologists, said, well, the one of those, John, could not have been written by John. John was written much later. It was written late 2nd century. So it could not have been written by John, who would have been dead by then. And then in Egypt, they discovered a papyrus, a fragment, and it was from the book of John. And it dates to 88 AD, and it's word for word exactly the same that you read in the book of John. And so now we no longer pretend that John didn't get written, at least in the age when John could have been alive. So it's easy to dismiss that. And I think that the story of the Fisherman's Tomb, that is the actual physical story, is sort of an embarrassment to the agnostics and to the guys that propound things like the Gospel of Mary Magdalene and both the Jewish cult theories and so on. I think particularly those inscriptions that she found, I don't think they can live with those, Stephen. I think that upsets their worldview to such a degree it would throw them into a terrible tizzy.
Do you think that through this book, is there more in Vatican? Are they doing more to get this story out now?
Well, they were selling our book in the Vatican Library. I was invited to go meet Pope Francis, but I'm physically not in good enough shape to go do that. We've had a screenplay made of our book. We've given the money from the book to charity. The reason I wrote the book was I was so horrified by the fact that nobody knew the story. I didn't know the story. When I went to Rome the first time with the socialist guide who was trying to sell me jewelry, I asked specifically, where is the Senate House? He said, that's nothing. You don't need to worry about that. They don't amount to anything. And then I said, is Peter buried under the Vatican when we're in the Vatican? He said, no, that was just a myth. Now, even by that time, the tomb had been discovered and you could actually, with arrangements, go see it. But I would have left the Vatican believing that was just a complete myth if I hadn't gone that day, with Michael Novak and actually seen it and then become more interested in it and learned about Carducci and the Strakes and so on.
It's a fascinating story, and I definitely, people should read your book, and there is the information online. And if you get a chance to go to Rome, I would love to go to the grotto. It's not exactly easy to get a ticket to it, from my understanding, but I'd love to do it.
Here, one caution, Stephen. There are all kinds of crooks selling tickets to the Scavi tour online. They're all a lie. The only way you can get a ticket to the Scavi tour is through the Vatican travel office, and you can get it. It's the hottest ticket, they say, in Europe, the hardest ticket to get, because there are less than 100 people allowed each day. But if you're a little flexible on time and on date, you can actually get in to see it. It's a little bit tight. And so you can't be too claustrophobic, and you probably have to be in a little better shape than me to do it these days. But it's absolutely astounding. First, you see you think of symbols of things. You start off way below ground, 70 feet below ground. Of course, it used to be a hill. You start up a road, and on either side of you, on the right side, there are these Roman tombs. One of them, you go by and there's a bronze sarcophagus. It has a family together, Mr. and Mrs. whatever, and I've forgotten, and it has together forever, and in a bronze sarcophagus. And around them are paintings, murals from all of the Euripides plays. Half of the plays we have, and then half of the plays were lost in the barbarian invasion. So you can see Hercules going down to hell to rescue a princess, and king going, the mother of a king going crazy and killing him, stuff from Euripides' plays. You move on a little further, and there's another tomb, the Valerian tomb. On one end are these proud statues of the Valerians, just what you'd expect. On the other end are these sad death masks, and you learn that the Valerians died, including the grandchildren first, and finally the grandfather from a plague. And so your life of a whole city, you finally, as you move up, you get to these little tiny graves. They include the graves of many of the first popes whom you're an expert in. You know that all the first 32 were all martyred, every single one of them, by the Romans. And several of them are buried right there because they wanted to be buried close to Peter. And finally, you get to Peter's simple grave. You realize that the reason why the Christian graves are so simple and the pagan graves are so ornate is the pagans thought they would spend eternity in those graves. The Christians it was just a way station on the way to heaven, and they didn't need a big grave at all. And so I find it very inspiring if people can go to it.
It's so amazing. And I mean, we could talk about this all day, and I'll just leave it that even if they hadn't found Peter's bones in there, what they learned about the early popes and what they learned about antiquity and Romans with the Valerian tombs and through these tombs is a priceless find.
Oh, it's amazing. There's a Botticelli, Botticelli's great painting is one of the gods returning as a swan, and supposedly, seducing a woman and making a god. Well, everybody thought that was just Botticelli. No, the very same painting's right down there in one of the Roman tombs. So you can see how the Renaissance painters all got inspired by the Roman ruins they encountered and so on. And of course, the busts and death masks are amazing to see, because you're realizing these are people just exactly like us in another time, but exactly like us.